The arrival of the Spanish to the Americas in 1492 effected one of the worst catastrophes to be experienced by any society at any point in history, as the native population of at least 50 million people, and maybe double that, was almost entirely wiped out. The Spanish were brutal, certainly, murdering, raping, torturing, enslaving, working the locals to death to mine gold. And though they had all the power of gods with gunpowder and steel, in fact we all know the locals took them to be gods in the beginning at least, it was the invisible weapons that did the worst damage. Typhus, cholera, the plague, in particular smallpox, swept through the native population, wiping out around 80% of them in the first 50 years. But it was a sword that cut both ways. Now, the discovery of the Americas changed the world forever, and Columbus brought back with him all the wonders of the New World: potatoes, cocoa beans, tobacco, tomatoes. I think the arrival of the tomato is still celebrated as a national holiday in Napoli. But in 1495, just 2 years after Columbus came back, they were rather more concerned with another of his imports: syphilis. The Spanish sailors, of course, had felt themselves quite free to take by force any woman they wanted in the Americas, thus ensuring the spread of one of history's worst sexually transmitted diseases. First mention of syphilis is found in the French soldiers while at war with Napoli in 1495, just 2 years after Columbus had come back to Europe. The disease was frequently lethal, eating away at the flesh down to the bone. The French decided to call it the Italian disease. The Italians called it the French disease, the Russians called it the Polish disease, and the Turkish called it the Christian disease, in that time-honored tradition of blaming all your problems on your neighbours. Soldiers were, of course, particularly vulnerable, as the availability of cheap prostitutes was about the only good thing about war at the time. And as one forward-thinking doctor of the age put it, "Men get it by doing it with women in their vulvas." Not that anyone listened to him, of course. Instead, they looked to the causes of the disease in the movements of the planets and the unfortunate alignment of celestial bodies. Others thought perhaps it was a plague sent by God to punish humanity for its immoral ways. When all else failed, they blamed it on witches. But others believed that one's moral health was what affected one's physical health, and in the 19th century in particular, a few voices said, well, perhaps masturbation might be responsible. As the innovator John Kellogg said, "The masturbator dies by his own hand." And so the 19th century saw a flood of anti-masturbation devices, which ranged from bent metal sheaths to spiky clamps which made any erection painfully impossible. John Kellogg himself innovated a kind of metal wire to be sewn through the foreskin. But recognizing the limited market potential of such a device, he hit upon another theory, that a high-fiber, low-sugar diet could reduce the lustful, sinful urges in the first place. Thus was born that famous recipe for celibacy that you might have tried: Kellogg's cornflakes. But back to syphilis. It was truly an awful disease to catch, as it could even eat away into your brain, causing you to go mad. And often the first part of your body to fall off was the nose, prompting a fashion in wooden and ceramic noses. There were even no-nose societies where the afflicted could gather together in brotherhood. Syphilis might even claim to be the origin of reconstructive surgery. As one doctor found, he could graft skin from the arm to your nose. But there your arm had to stay for 3 weeks until a second operation could be performed to remove it. You could get syphilis through childbirth and mother's milk, but normally it was through sex, which was problematic for the priests, cardinals, and even one pope, who wore the purple flowers of syphilitic ulcers on the face, a telling confession they hadn't quite kept to their vows. Luckily, modern medicine was there to help. Of course, back in those days, if it wasn't hurting, it wasn't working. And so the ulcers were cut off, burned off, or treated with strong acids, all to little effect, but at least the patient felt like he got his money's worth. Another cure, which was partially effective, was to put the patient's head in a box with some mercury. A fire was lit below, causing the mercury to vaporize. And so it was said that a night with Venus led to a lifetime with Mercury. It was actually partially effective, as I said. However, the mercury was also poisonous. Another great cure was in the 1920s, when one doctor won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that syphilis could be cured outright by infecting the patient with malaria. The high fever that you caught with the malaria killed the syphilitic bacteria completely. Of course, then you had malaria. Anyway, then came 1940, the introduction of penicillin, and syphilis soon became a thing of the past for anybody with access to a pharmacy. Of course, for 12 million people today in the developing world, that's still not always a possibility.